Genevieve, you're in charge of the IYSSE. These demonstrations are predominantly young people. Why do you think that is?
Thanks, Cheryl. Well, I think that it comes as no surprise that young people are turning out in such high numbers in these protests. This isn't an era in which you have to convince a young person that there is something deeply wrong with society. I think actually Tom and Christoph both touched on it. They're not, I think, motivated by one single issue. But they're motivated by concerns over inequality, over climate change, police brutality, of course, imperialist war, school shootings, student debt, attacks on democratic rights, just the Trump administration in and of itself. For many young people, they entered into political life. The first president of which they were really politically conscious was President Trump. The response to COVID, I really think there's no end to the list. More broadly, I'd say that I think that there are two maybe real fundamental features of society which have led to this vast radicalization that we've seen in young people. And I think that the first is opposition to war and militarism. This generation was born, the emerging generation, so Gen Z, a lot of them were born after the turn of the century. And that means that their entire lives have been dominated by US imperialism. Many of them have not lived a single day in which the US wasn't at war. Many were born after the start of the Afghanistan war, which has been going on since 2001. And I think that you really can't separate the question of police violence from the questions of war. It's the war at home, so to speak. The ruling elite protects its interests abroad using military troops, and at home it uses its police and sometimes the military troops, as we're seeing. But for this generation of youth, these questions have been front and center. This is things like institutionalized drone assassinations, all the police murders that you now see on social media. Mass shootings at schools. These have all become part of normal life. In schools now, they actually perform active shooter drills where you have to actually go through an exercise to pretend as if somebody was in the school. That's how frequent these things are. In particularly poorer areas and working class areas, they have armed guards patrolling school hallways. So this is not something that's kind of abstract. For the young generation. It is all in their day-to-day lives. They see the effects of US imperialism. I think it's also important to note that in the real living memory of this generation are absolutely bloody scenes of the shootings in Parkland, for example, which set off a wave of protests among high school youth. There was Sandy Hook Elementary School, I remember, which was a horrific, violent attack that killed 27 people. And many of them children, Virginia Tech. And I think that there's just overwhelming opposition to war and militarism among young people. And, all of these things have a profound effect on consciousness. No one is going to ever forget the images that they've seen through these protests. No one, I know I could never forget the image of that elderly man who was shoved over by police and then a pool of blood, gathers by his head. People are drawing broad, far-reaching conclusions from this. And I think that the second major aspect that maybe I'll just touch on briefly is the question of inequality. And I think this is going to, again, emerge as a central question, particularly in the aftermath, kind of as we begin to reopen the economy and see the effects of funneling trillions of dollars into the stock market and Wall Street. All of this has to be extracted from the working class. The millennial generation, which is sort of the older youth, they entered the job market on the onset of the 2008 financial crash, which ushered in just a tidal wave of social distress. That was overseen by a Democrat, Obama. He was elected on, sold to young people as the president of hope and change. He funneled trillions of dollars to Wall Street, and the millennial generation really never recovered. They still feel the effects of that. And now it's happening on a much larger scale in response to the COVID pandemic, and it's going to devastate another generation. You could cite all sorts of statistics which outline this, from opioid crisis, rise in suicides, credit card debt, student debt. It's really incalculable. But and the COVID pandemic is the same. 7.7 million workers under 30 who are all of a sudden unemployed, and a lot of those jobs are not going to come back. So, I think that really the situation is that capitalism has nothing to offer the youth. Nothing really outside of war, more violence, more death, unemployment. And the youth know that. They know that, and they're angry. And I think finding opposition is not going to be an issue. There's not complacency among this generation. What is lacking, though, is a real clear political program and perspective. Young people really have to take up and commit themselves to building a socialist leadership, turning out to the working class, to be identifying very clearly what it is we're fighting for and what it is we're fighting against.